Hello, everyone. We'll get started here in a few minutes. As you can see, there's a chat on the right-hand side there. Feel free to pop a comment in there. Okay. Hi, I'm Monica Miller, and I am the Marketing and Promotions Coordinator at Caitlin Press. Caitlin Press is an independent Canadian publisher located on the Sunshine Coast in British Columbia. We publish culturally significant books, including fiction, nonfiction, and poetry. Caitlin Press is also home of Dagger Editions, an imprint for the voices of queer women-identifying writers. Betsy and I are both located in Vancouver, which is the traditional unceded territories of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh nations. I work remotely here, but Caitlin Press is located on the traditional territories of the Squamish, Seashelt, Slayamon, and Clahos First Nations. And my apologies if I got any of the pronunciation wrong. We'd love to know where you're joining us from. Some people have put their locations in the chat. Some people in Nova Scotia. I saw Ontario. It's great to have all of you with us here. I'll start with a bit of housekeeping in case you're not familiar with live stream events or crowdcast. The chat on the side there, you could put any comments you want. You can also ask questions. If you have a direct question, I'll be in the chat answering questions or tagging it as a question for Betsy to answer later. Also down on the bottom bar, there's a poll, so you can tell us, you can answer the poll, or you can ask a question direct in the question and answer function. And you can also vote, upvote on other questions. So if someone's already asked a question that you really, ooh, this is a juicy one, I want to know what Betsy would say for that, feel free to upvote it. And there's also a big green button here to buy the book from Caitlin Press's website. And clicking that shouldn't interfere with the broadcast at all. If you do drop out or something happens with your internet and you drop out, you can click the same link that got you here the first time. You can come back in and it'll start where we are in the broadcast. And also, we are recording, so we'll make sure to share the video afterwards. You could also mention if you want to come up and ask your question live. So I have the ability to bring you up on stage, and you can ask Betsy your question directly. So feel free to mention if you want to be invited up. No pressure, of course. As I mentioned, the buy the book link is down on the bottom there. You can buy it from our website if we ship all across Canada. The Vancouver launch that we did have to postpone due to COVID was, our bookseller was Massey Books, and they had already brought in stock for us. And so if you are in Vancouver or in the Lower Mainland and you would like a copy of the book, Massey Books is doing delivery. I think they're still doing contactless pickup, touch-free pickup. But so Massey Books is, I think it's masseybooks.com, and they'll have all the information. They have an online shop. And yeah, if you're somewhere where you don't know who your local bookseller is and if they're doing deliveries or pickups, feel free to post in the chat and ask me. Just say, hey, Monica, or, you know, where can I find it in, you know, Calgary, Alberta, and I will try and help you while Betsy is talking, I'm going to be behind the screen. So, without further ado, I'd like to introduce Betsy and just tell you a little bit about her and the book. You're probably already familiar if you're here, but it's always nice to get a reminder of the breadth of Betsy's work. So with this new book, Betsy Warland has now published 13 books of poetry, creative nonfiction, and lyric prose. She's an author, mentor, teacher, manuscript consultant, and editor. Betsy received the City of Vancouver Mayor's Award for Literary Excellence in 2016, and her 2010 book of essays on new approaches to writing, Breathing the Page, Reading the Act of Writing, became a bestseller. Betsy is the director of the Vancouver Manuscript Intensive, co-founder of the National Creative Writing Nonfiction Collective, and she established the Writers' Studio at Simon Fraser University. Lost Lagoon, Lost in Thought is written in Betsy's well-known lyric prose style. It is an up-close, poetic account of the human's relationship between Stanley Park's lagoon wildlife and Vancouver's fast-paced city living. Shayna Lambert, who's actually in here today watching, said that Betsy evokes the mysteries and beauties of her beloved lagoon and cries with wisdom and grief for the losses of nature and the life that remains. So I'd like to pull Betsy up now.
Hello.
And I'm going to turn my video off and leave it up to you for until we have some question discussion time. So take it away, Betsy.
Take it away. So now I'm, of course, feeling incredibly shy, but I will. It's so wonderful to see all these comments coming in from all over. It's just very moving. And I first of all want to thank all of you for joining this launch today. I feel incredibly grateful for that. Really, what the launch is about, who the launch is about, is this, Lost Lagoon, Lost in Thought. I will be reading from it for a little bit, but first I want to have some thank yous as well. I want to thank Vicki Johnson, publisher of Lost Lagoon, an extraordinary book designer, for this cover, which is the French flap that closes but then opens out. And I just love this cover. So thank you, Vicki. Also, Caitlin, particularly Monica and Sarah. And blurbs in the back. Hey, I write a lot of these, and I tell you, they mean a huge amount. They only seem to mean more to me as time goes on. And I'm so grateful for these 3 blurbs by Daryl J. McLeod, Shayna Lambert, and Renee Serro, Jeannie Seklikar. Thank you. They were elegant and very meaningful. And also Lisa Weil, and my dear friend in Montreal, who offered to do a thorough copy edit, and she did an extraordinary one. Thank you, Lisa. I meant a great deal. And also my partner and co-Lagoon lover, Ingrid Rose. Thank you all. So the Lost Lagoon is a collection of 55 prose poems. They could also be called lyric prose. They could also be called creative nonfiction. They could be called a memoir. But actually, when we looked at what to call them, Vicki and I, we decided that was probably the most accurate genre term to use. I'm happy to be back in the poetry realm again. I haven't been for quite a long time. I started off as a poet. My first number of books were poetry. So it feels really great. There's 55 of them in here. And there's a postscript at the end that is additional piece commenting on Lost Lagoon. The name of the narrator is The Human. And I'm going to be reading from a selection that's about, the reading will be about 15 or so minutes long. It'll give you a flavor for it, a taste for it. It won't be covering all the different characters in Lost Lagoon, but you'll get a sense of it. And I want to dedicate this reading, as is the book is dedicated, to the same 3 women. And this is what the dedication says. With gratitude and respect, I dedicate this book to Pauline, Canada's first performance artist and Indigenous poet, and that's Pauline Johnson. Jean, the beaver lady of Lost Lagoon, and Fiona, the swan lady of Lost Lagoon. Number 1. The human is at a loss for words, considers and considers, wonders, is this loss of words perhaps why the human is a writer? The desire to describe something that the human cherishes makes words scatter like a flock of startled bush tits. The very word cherishes is suspect. Passé. Okay, the human thinks again. Let's begin with its name, Lost Lagoon. Its very name is a conundrum. How could one misplace a lagoon? Standing on the shore, any passerby can observe it's not a lagoon, but a small lake or perhaps a pond. Over the decades, the human has walked around the lagoon, chatting with various companions, but now dwelling close to it, lives with it. The difference between around and with. Difference between pointing a camera, voice, or index finger, and standing still, watching, listening, sniffing, occasionally speaking softly or returning a bird's call. Just across the street from the high and low-rise buildings, Cheek and Jalnus, Lost Lagoon life is, once again, the human is at a loss for words. The lagoon resists being depicted, summed up. The human admires this. Number 2. That said, under the cover of darkness and human absence, the lagoon spills into surrounding life. Many are the nights that the human is jolted awake by alarmed quacking of geese and ducks. Coyote, owl, or otter are on the prowl and have startled them. This panic echoes inside the human's head. Number 8. For years, decades in fact, whenever visiting Stanley Park, the human puzzled over its name, Lost Lagoon. How did it get this nonsensical name? It seemed an oxymoron or a Zen koan. Then water drove the human to water. The apartment flooded, and the human moved here. Just like the magnetism of the river 4 kilometers away from the family farm, Lost Lagoon magnetized the human. Now this close proximity has provoked an investigation into its curious name. One might have guessed it was named by a poet. Indeed it was. E. Pauline Johnson, part Mohawk, part English, was fond of paddling her canoe there when it was a quiet cove. Here a however hovers. With summer tides during Johnson's favored paddling time, her refuge was temporarily lost. Then lost permanently in 1916, when construction of the Stanley Park Causeway cut the cove off from the sea. Lost too for the Squamish, Musqueam, Tsleil-Waututh, Burrard Nations peoples, who harvested clams and other sea life from the mudflats for generations, probably centuries. Lost, Lu, to loosen, divide, cut apart, the causeway separating the sea and the tidal flat. Lost, Lu, for loosen, to forfeit, these unceded territories of the indigenous peoples, lost, another word for taken. Number 18. Second week January, the human suddenly smiles at the sight of the otters slipping and sliding on the frozen lagoon like 5 miniature Charlie Chaplins. Then the human softly laughs at the sound of the happy couple overhead. Becalmed for the past 5 months, their routine duet loudly announces that mating rituals have officially commenced in the goose world. The human began referring to them thus after realizing this constant honking alarm and bickering debate was not in fact a flock of Canada geese, but the production of one vociferous couple. Upon daily observation, the human concluded that the couple's ceaseless honking, alighting, taking flight, bickering as they flapped, circling around, repeating it all again and again was likely neurotic. The human also noted that the larger flock kept its distance during these months, must have also reached this conclusion. Think of two rusty hinges or a teeter-totter much in need of oil. Always in the lead, the female's higher pitch honk is matched every third beat by her pursuing male partner's hoarse replying, honk! Their ongoing squabble, their comings and goings, now a permanent counterpoint in the human's daily landscape and soundscape. Often, they are comic relief. Often, they remind of poignant faithfulness. Often, they remind of insatiable human restlessness, longing, and doubt. "28. Bird life is a barometer for the lagoon. During the summer and fall drought of 2016, all forms of wildlife suffered. Birds fell silent, flew as little as possible. Even the forest was enveloped by an eerie stillness. It was as if the very effort and moisture to produce calls or songs required too much, taxed lungs' increasing effort to inhale the emaciated air too much. The air was weighty, odorless. Humans wore masks, even inside. The particles so minute, closed windows failed to protect our lungs. The lagoon itself was steadily depleting, its water levels dangerously low. With no fresh water to replenish, its color and consistency reminded of pea soup. Its surface dull. The playful mirroring of its surrounds and sky no longer existed. Even one of the rarely seen foot-long carp lay dead on the new shore where the water used to be. That fall and into early spring, trees were so parched they found it hard to retain purchase in the moisture-depleted soil, collapsed with no warning nor seeming provocation. A number of the largest ones lingered until the following summer, but even then, when precipitation increased, suddenly crashed down, too depleted to recover. The lagoon's water life were also depleted. Only the Canada geese, mallards, various kinds of gulls, occasional cormorants and herons, and a few wood ducks and a couple of coots mated and repopulated the lagoon. Even with the improved rainfall in 2017, the waterfowl diversity numbers remained depleted. Widgeons, grebes, mergansers, canvasbacks, teals, scaups once again failed to arrive. Quietude also enveloped human visitors. It's now February 2018, and the usual winter ceaseless rains have returned. So too have the Canada geese, mallards, occasional seagulls, and cormorants taking a break from the sea. But a great many of the waterfowl remain absent. Most of the songbirds layer in over the weeks, their ardent songs filling the air like musicians tuning their instruments in an inverted orchestra pit. The human wonders, are we out of the woods? Hesitates. Feels the seductive pull of this quick fix thinking, but knows No, we are in the woods, more dependent than ever on one another. Number 41. Upon moving here, the human was soon mystified by a tenderly elegant yet puzzling conifer tree on the east shore of the lagoon. Its reddish-brown fibrous bark and needle branches signaled some type of conifer, but numerous searches through various tree books turned up a blank. Adding to the puzzlement was a curious matter of the tree dropping all its needles in the fall, yet it didn't look remotely like a larch. Eventually, her newly purchased Vancouver tree book solved the mystery. This tree was a dawn redwood. Yes, needle branches looked like a redwood's, but they were softer and emerged brownish red in spring, turned green through summer, turned reddish brown in the fall before dropping to the ground. Originally a conifer, the dawn redwood transformed itself into a deciduous tree in response to a radical change in the sunlight patterns during the end of Cretaceous period and the Paleocene period. It's about 100 million years ago. Fossils told of its existence, but it was believed to have disappeared with the dinosaurs. Only in 1941 was the dawn redwood found in a remote valley in China. A few days ago, the human's dear brother told her that he is dying. And somehow the dawn redwood story comforts the human, as does its gentle presence. Number 46. The tidal flat adjacent to Cole Harbor, Johnson hated that name, was drained and turned into a freshwater lake by the completion of the Stanley Park Causeway in 1916, but remained nameless until 1922, when it was officially given the name Johnson had given it, Lost Lagoon. While musing on all this history, the human has gradually realized that Pauline Johnson was Canada's first performance poet. Her stage performances throughout Canada, the United States, and England were legendary. Her schedule fully booked for years. Johnson's Mohawk name, Daga Ian Wage, which meant double life, came from her parents, her father being a Mohawk chief and her mother being English. She dressed in traditional tribal wear for the first half of her show and recited Indigenous bass verse. After intermission, Johnson appeared on the stage in fashionable English Victorian dress and recited traditional English verse. Her rapt audiences would, and this is a quote, weep during the recitation of one poem and laugh during the telling of an anecdote that poked gentle fun at herself, end quote. Considering that she retired from the stage in 1909, her total theatrical transformation from one being into another must have impacted audiences as much as the special effects of Stanley Kubrick's film 2001: A Space Odyssey in 1968. By 1911, Johnson was poor, very ill. Friends rallied around her and published her stories in Legends of Vancouver that sold an astonishing 10,000 copies and is still considered a classic. Johnson's funeral in 1913, a civic holiday, was at the time the largest in Vancouver's history. At her request, she was buried in an unmarked grave close to Siwash Rock in Stanley Park. Number 53. The parks board has trapped the poor beavers, is scrawled in large white letters under the footbridge where the main dam had been. The operative words here, had been. Systematic. Late last winter, when the human arrived one day, a caterpillar tractor had completely removed the dam. The human had assiduously looked for the beavers, periodically inquired with other lagoon regulars, but none had seen the beaver. No one except the photographer. In the beaver lady's absence, the beavers had no well-informed advocate. Recently, the humans spotted the old patriarch by the original lodge. Other than that, there's no sign of their 3-generational family. The human's heart sinks in her chest. Loss seems more devastating when sensed or suspected for some time, where there's the false hope that you have been wrong. Just now, looking back through this manuscript, the human is surprised at how little the beaver are mentioned. In actuality, they were one of her favorite mammals that she most watched for, delighted in. Reading Eager, The Surprising Secret Life of Beavers and Why They Matter, the human is reminded that the beaver is the official emblem of Canada. In the book, the human found out why. For 200 years, beavers were trapped for their much sought-after pelts used in European hats and outerwear. Being a major economic base for settlers, they were trapped to near extinction. Their waterways management has created most of our topsoil, as well as food sources for an array of animals. Excellent engineers, beavers' numerous building techniques have been borrowed by humans, and some of their dams have been found to be 1,000 years old. Most wrenching is this. They are the only non-human beings to share the same defining traits we humans have. Changing the natural environment to enable survival, creating a strong intergenerational family, building permanent homes. A couple months later, the human catches sight of the old patriarch. He's evaded being caught. Then more months pass with no sight of him, until late fall when he has suddenly rebuilt the dam underneath the bridge where the bulldozer had removed it months ago. Its construction isn't top-notch. He's old, alone, giving it his best shot. So here we are. And I don't know quite how we do the next bit, but I think that Monica is going to be sending me some questions or comments.
Yes. So let me see if I can get us both up on screen. Okay. So we had planned to have Cynthia Flood join Betsy to ask some questions. Unfortunately, we were thwarted by technology.
We tried.
We did. So Cynthia sent some questions. So I figured we can get the Q&A started with that. And we've also have a number of questions that have been asked here in the Q&A. The chat has been mostly comments. A number of people are having trouble with a frozen screen. So sometimes closing the window and reopening the link has worked, sometimes refreshing. Another suggestion was to pause and then press play again. Typically, these problems are from your internet connection, just if it's slow or if there's a hiccup. But there is a recording to remind everyone.
Hey, Cynthia's here. Here I am. I'm glad to be here. Cynthia just came up.
Oh, there's Cynthia. Cynthia,
Okay.
your ears must have been burning. We just saw her pop up in the chat. So let's start with her first question. Betsy, your book contains 55 entries on Lost Lagoon, some just snapshots, some longer meditations. I don't imagine you said, hey, I'm going to write 55 diary entries on Lost Lagoon and that'll be a book. So what was the process? At what point did you realize you were writing a book in diary form? And how did that change, if it did, your method of composition?
Okay. It's good that I had time to think about these questions because they're very good questions. Since 1987, with my book Serpent Right, I started working with a book-length narrative. So I've been working in a book-length narrative ever since. And so this is a book-length narrative, even though it's written in these entries. I started to clearly work with the entries, really clearly, with Bloodroot, and that came out in 2000. And will be coming out again this fall in a new edition. So quite a few of my writing friends are actually fiction writers, and I think partly just because they're, other than the great people, is that there is a connection for me with working with the book-length narrative. That's interested me, and that's what I've been doing for a long time in different forms. So I think in terms of when I first started writing it, I didn't anticipate writing it, but the first piece came. And it came almost, now and then you get a piece, it seems like it just drops out of the sky in your lap. It really is rare, but that's what happened with that first piece. And I knew that there was a lot there, but I didn't know what it was. I could just feel it. Then I just started writing more entries, but always not there. It was, I would just spend time with the lagoon quietly. And then I would come back to my apartment. Sometimes I would write something down right away. Sometimes not. It would be a few days or even a couple of weeks later. It just sort of kind of occupied gradually and coalesced. I don't think it would have worked for me to be writing there or taking notes even there. I had to be, when I was there, I had to be there 100%, And so since, looking back now, I realize one of the appeals to me, besides my concern about climate change, is it was the first time I was living with something that reminded me of my rural life of growing up on a farm and being in nature a lot on my own, even like going down to the river on my bike or my horse 2 miles away. It brought in that kind of solitary being with nature, with my life that I've been in for many decades, which is an urban dweller. So what we have here in the lagoon is there's a low rise next to me. I'm in a low rise. It's 5 stories high. There are high rises across the street that are really high. And so you just walk one building down, cross a road, walk down a little hill, and there's the lagoon. So it's to me, it was fascinating how urban life and wildlife could be so cheap by jowl. And I was really interested in investigating that. And also it brought together these two parts of myself, which I didn't realize till much later in writing it, but it reunited something for me, which was very precious. So yes, so the lagoon became my mentor, basically. Yep.
That's really interesting. And I think you actually answered Shayna Lambert's question about the first seeds of the book and what triggered you to begin writing about the lagoon, which was the most popular voted question. So So Cynthia's next question was referring to some entries in Lost Lagoon, Lost in Thought, refer to Thoreau, Pauline Johnson, Vita Sackville-West, and quite a few refer to friends. She notices that entry number 13 is the first where you mention anyone in your birth family. As you wrote, what did other people's view of Lost Lagoon and of the natural world in general contribute to your process, to the eventual text?
Yeah, okay. Again, a good writer's question to another writer. Okay. Well, interesting enough, I didn't know Pauline Johnson had anything to do with the Lagoon. So that I just sort of stumbled on after I had written a few of the pieces. And that was just I just felt, I could get quite emotional about it. I just felt like so grateful to make that connection with Pauline Johnson and give her the respect that we sort of have kind of lost in today's very contemporary world. And her spirit, I just loved her spirit, like how she hated the name Cole Harbor. So there was Pauline, there was the Beaver Lady, which I gradually got to know, and the Swan Lady, which even took longer to get to know, because she very much was very devoted to her swans, and she didn't really want to talk to anybody else except them. But that, and then there's the photographer, who is also a woman, who appears toward the end, who kept very much to herself. But these women started to be kind of, I don't know, I can't say supporting me, but they kind of, I felt their presence in writing this. And I don't think I've ever had anything quite like that happen before. The Beaver Lady had very serious health problems and finally had to stop coming. She would come by bus from New Westminster every day and stay there. This is spring through summer and late fall, and not go back till after twilight. She was so devoted. And then the swans, one of them was killed by one of the otter family, and they got moved out of the lagoon. And so Fiona, the Swan Lady, she also lost that anchor in her life. So those changes have happened even in this last 5 years. Photographer, I don't see as much of either. I think that the photographer still is there, but there's so many people right now because of the pandemic in the park and around the lagoon, who some are sitting there and taking it in, but mostly they're just jogging around or doing, talking on their phone or whatever. So it's changed quite a bit. I was relieved today when I was visiting it, and there were the first turtles that they had finally come up out of the bottom of the lagoon. And that's when you know it's late spring. And they were like soaking up the sun on these logs floating in the lagoon. So these people all contributed, as well as other writers. And I'll mention women writers. There are also men writers, but I'm going to mention women writers. Certainly Emily Dickinson, Phyllis Webb, incredible poet, BC poet. Alice Oswald, who wrote the English poet, amazing poet, who wrote the book, The River Dart, all about the river. Charlotte Gill. Sarah DeLue, who also wrote about the river. Sharon Brutala, who really early on was writing about nature in a way that was clearly coming from a woman's experience in the world. Helen MacDonald, with H is for Hawk. And T.T. Williams, U.S. writer, Mormon in, I think, Utah. And I'm forgetting her first name, but it's Tempest Williams. Also read her early on. So I think what came up for me was wanting to write about nature in a way that wasn't from a point of expertise, which it often is. It's from a point of someone's, and it's usually men, but not always. It's their profession. It's their public profile. And so that's a quite different way of writing about nature. It has its appeal and value for sure, but I really wanted this to be from the point of view of the human, who is saying, I'm the human, I'm always the human, I'm not Betsy, I'm not she, he. To the natural world, particularly the animals, I'm the human, irrevocably. So I wanted to acknowledge how that changes the whole relationship, and yet how if you start to just be very quiet with nature and with the wildlife, things change. And more is revealed to you. And that's when the teaching happens.
Yeah, with the addition of the human, we do hear the narrator, but as a reader, we're able to insert ourselves as well.
Exactly. Good point. Yeah.
So I'm going to start, before I finish with Cynthia's questions, I'm going
Okay.
to go on to some of the questions from
Sure. That's good.
attendees.
Okay, good.
So Monica Meneghetti asks, what was the most interesting writing challenge you faced in writing this?
Well, it was kind of interesting because I didn't, typically in my writing life, when I'm finishing one book and we're doing the final editing and I've started another manuscript, there's always been this kind of connection between finishing one and starting a new one. That wasn't the case with Lost Lagoon. There was a pause between Oscar between, where I wasn't writing. I had a lot. I was moving. I had a flooded apartment. There was a lot happening. So there was this gap. And then when I started writing these pieces, I didn't think of them as being, the beginning of a manuscript. So it took a while, and I actually really like that. I think somehow it's connected with the human and that narrative position, and I'm very interested in narrative positions. So it kind of dislodged some sort of familiar ways of writing and visualizing what's going on for me. So gradually, as the pieces continued to come, then I realized, I guess it's a manuscript, and I also hadn't written clearly in a sort of poetic sensibility quite as much as when I was writing these pieces. So it all was quite different. And I think that only made the manuscript better.
Mm. Ahava in the chat mentioned Terry Tempest Williams.
Yeah, Terry Tempest Williams. Thank you, Ahava. Wonderful writer, yeah.
So Ingrid says that each book you write takes a different form. How does that work?
How does that work? Okay, because I think that each narrative, and again, if you're working with a book-length narrative, you're working with a narrative, has different architecture. It occupies a particular kind of space and see what I'm doing? Everything about it is unique to that story, that narrative. And so it's one of the things that most fascinates me is to just sort of gradually follow it and let it tell me what form it wants to be in. Because if you put it in the wrong form, there are all kinds of problems that arise because of that. So that's probably the thing that is interesting to me, and that, as I just previously described, how this manuscript came together in a very different way. And but it seemed key for me to, from the beginning, and I don't even know where it came from, but to refer to the narrator as the human. That was key. If I hadn't done that, it would have been quite a different manuscript.
Mm-hmm. So the next question from Yonina Curtin. Lost seems to be a thread tying humans to the wildlife at Lost Lagoon. When you began writing, did you know that this would be a part of the book?
No. I thought I was gaining something that I had missed for so long. I had been living in East Vancouver, which has a lot of wonderful things about it, but it's really far away from nature. And my nature there was walking around Britannia Plainfield. That was my nature, So, so when I first arrived here, I was more really cognizant of what I was gaining, what I was being given. It was like, this is fantastic. So it gradually started to unfold. And there's one line in Lost Lagoon about elation turning into, I don't have quite the right words. Cynthia maybe can help me here. But elation turning into grief. And what happened, and it starts with the E, that word too. It's, and that started when I started to see some of the effects of climate change on the lagoon, which were very tangible. Also, I was going through that period of time when my only two siblings, I had two brothers, died within less than 2 years apart. The one here that I referred to in the piece I read, same building. And that was there. So there was a lot of loss, as well as some dear friends. One I'll mention, Nancy Richler, and I remember walking around the lagoon with her, and she loved nature. And so there was a number of deaths that were going on as well as what was happening to the lagoon. So the loss gradually found its way in, but there was this counterbalance of the elation. That's what it was, elation analogy. The elation, and sometimes it's very quiet, like to see those turtles today was just like so wonderful. So it just became not oppositional, just flowing in and out of each other.
Mm-hmm. Nitya in the comments commented that it feels like it has a grounding in spiritual experience in how the lagoon has influenced your writing.
Yes, absolutely, absolutely. And certainly I've been practicing as a Buddhist for 30 some years, and the lagoon is definitely one of my teachers, you know, in terms of, as I said before, not only a mentor, but a teacher, where what matters is to be completely attentive and get yourself out of the way so you can actually, you know, be there and meet it and take it in and learn from it. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Let's see. JG Julia Chaco says or asks that you wrote this before the pandemic.
Yes.
How do you? Sorry, the question jumped off my screen. You wrote this before the pandemic. How do you think your work would have changed if you'd wrote it during the pandemic? Well, and you know, someone else had sort of asked, like, has your relationship with the lagoon changed? Which I think factors in.
Yeah, it has. Well, you know, the piece I read about the drought, I got a little bit choked up reading that, you know, and I've definitely been thinking, I'm being reminded of that because everything has changed here. And for a couple of weeks that summer, everything changed. It just like changed. And certainly having to wear masks and people with any kind of lung asthma or anything, very, very risky. Seeing the animals going in the forest, and there was not a sound, there was not a fragrance. It was totally weird. And so I feel already that experience foreshadowed the one we're in, and they're connected. They're completely connected in terms of the kinds of decisions and ways we've been living that aren't tenable, you know, and are causing profound damage. So it would have been a very different book if I had started it and then the pandemic happened. It would have been a very different book. Probably the grieving would have been much stronger, for sure. But I don't regret it, because I think that there needs to be this kind of, it's not one or the other. As I said, they flow in and out of each other. And so I think it will be of interest to people who maybe didn't experience that 2016 drought, but there's things about it in this book that I think they'll relate to because of the pandemic. And watching how people who can are gravitating toward nature. It's really interesting. And they may be on their phones, and running down the path, sort of like you have to get out of the way, joggers, forgive me, joggers, but there does need to be some awareness with some of them. So it's not like they're all obviously sort of taking it in, but that's where they're what do you call it? Retreating to. That's where they're seeking solace, and so something is happening. Something's happening, even though on the surface it's a variety of ways how something is happening. From being annoyed at someone because they won't keep 6 feet away from you, to being really touched by seeing mothers with their infants sitting on a bench looking out at Lost Lagoon. So yeah.
So has your relationship with the lagoon changed since finishing the book and publishing? Paraphrasing a question from Jeff Hancock.
Hi, Jeff. Hey, that's Stratford, Ontario. Would you say it again to me?
How do you feel about the lagoon today? Like, I guess since finishing the book, since publishing.
Yeah. The lagoon is. I'm so glad that there is the book because it's another anchor for me to the lagoon, and sometimes I get scared, and sometimes I get very worried about the lagoon in terms of some of the decisions that are being made, and very worried about it. On the other hand, it's there, and it's doing everything it can to be resilient and maintain what it has to offer us, which is a lot. So that encourages me. And that's all I can say. It's not idealized. I probably at some points in the earlier part of writing Lost Lagoon had more of an idealized version of it. It's good that that's gone, but I'm still incredibly moved by it and absolutely intrigued by it.
Yeah, when reading it, I was really struck by like your close observations, how by going every day, probably you may have even been multiple times a day, you notice those little differences,
yes,
right?
Yes,
those gradual changes.
Yep.
And like the section you read on the beavers, I was like, why are they getting rid of the dam? Like,
I know.
What is the Parks Board thinking?
It's really hard to know. I know the Parks Board got major cutbacks, and they probably have way too much to manage thoroughly and thoughtfully. There is, of course, this whole sort of argument between what's invasive, right, and what's it's not indigenous. I can't remember the right term, but there is this whole argument about that. So I know that once before they had done this with the beavers because the beaver lady told me all about it. It's in the book, and so there gets to be this kind of let's do this because whatever. But it tends to be short-term thinking on these decisions because that's probably all the time anybody has to give to them is short-term thinking. So I very much hope the beavers somehow come back. But I think that someone told me they saw a beaver with the old guy. So hey, maybe that they can get going again because they are incredible.
In the chat, Eileen has said native species is maybe the phrase you were looking for.
Maybe, yeah.
So, go ahead.
No, I'm good. Yeah.
A question. We have a bit of time for a few more questions before we hit the 60-minute mark.
Okay.
So Kat Bori says, it's so interesting that you found your own nest, and it is unanticipated, as I recall, in the West End. Yet here you are launching a book based on your new locale.
Yeah.
What do the rest of us need to learn from how you took such a change and turned part of the experience into a book?
I think I'll go back to this. I think, and I didn't see this for a long time. I think that when we can reconnect one major formative part of the story of our lives with another one that's decades even apart, and they're both really important. There's more than two, obviously, but if you can sometimes get that connection, then something really different happens, and really exciting, and it connects these inside you, deep inside you, connects these two seemingly having nothing to do practically with each other, parts of your life, and which is of course not true, right? But on the surface, it can feel that way, and so I think that's what was very powerful for me when I moved here, and I did not anticipate that. I came here because I was concerned about my brother. His health was starting to have some problems, but nothing serious, and I just thought I need to be closer to him. So I also, I'm a little bit embarrassed to say, but I also, when I had the flood, I got so that I didn't want to go up on the drive because you know how we always say to each other, how are you doing? And I thought, you don't want to know. You don't want to know how I'm doing. And I thought, I had never experienced the flood, and I would have never understood what that's like. And not only did I lose my home, I lost my office. So I would only go up on the drive on Sunday mornings and and that certain nights, off nights, to shop because I just found it so hard to be able to bridge that. But I think I also realized I needed to be somewhere in the city where I was more anonymous. And that surprised me because the drive is fantastic in terms of running into people and getting to know the shopkeepers over years, right? But I actually needed to be more solitary. And so when I'm out and about, and that maybe helped me tune into the lagoon more. I don't know, but maybe.
So we have time for a couple more questions. Cheryl Latimer asks, do you write about the smells of and around the lagoon during different seasons? I'm sure the smells change. Can you talk about this?
It's a good question, and I haven't written about it very much in the book.
It must be hard to describe.
Yeah, it is hard to describe. Novelists are generally better at that in terms of real detail. It does change, but I'm probably particularly when it's really low, and there's been that condition I described was just painful. So I think that I can't say that that's been foremost in my experience of it, but I know it's there. Yeah.
So the last question that we have is one of Cynthia's. Right. But I wanted to give you, is there any questions that we haven't asked? I know there are a lot of questions that we haven't gotten to. I know there's not enough time to get to them all, but there's a lot of questions about your inspirations and referring to the self in third person in books, and writing time. So maybe if we just do one last question from the question and answer. acknowledging that there are so many great questions in here. And
yes, and
thank
I
you
just
all
have to
for.
give a shout out to one of my cousins who I haven't heard from for years in the States. So hi, Ruth. That's great. We grew up in the same area. Yeah.
Oh, fantastic.
Yeah. So, question, should we go to
So,
Cynthia's or do you have one there?
okay, there's one last one from the Q&A, and then we'll finish
Okay.
with Cynthia's.
Okay, sounds good.
So Madalena says, there's no sense of human time in Lost Lagoon, Lost in Thought. Did the lagoon inform the way the human was thinking and feeling about time?
Yeah. Good question from Athens. Hi, Madalena. Time is really measured by a different thing, eh? So, like, for example, it's so different. Like for me to get so excited to see the turtles today, like that's a whole different. It's a whole different kind of time. So there's all kinds of, you're very, once you're starting to watch the plant life and the aquatic life and the mammal and bird life, you start to really gear yourself to those kinds of time. I don't even call them frames, sort of time trajectories. And I love it. I just love it. It feels so much more real in terms of time and accurate. So there is, you'll notice that from time to time in the book, that sense of time. But it's a great respite from the way we are so driven with what we believe to be real time, which I think is driving a lot of us kind of crazy. So, yeah.
Yeah, some people are commenting in the chat about how time is also changed now in
absolutely.
in the pandemic.
Absolutely. And I have to say, and I feel a bit embarrassed about this, but I mean, there's many things that are very troubling and disturbing about the pandemic. But there are also ways that are opening to us that can be very nourishing. And for me, to have a quieter city and a quieter life, I really needed to have it. I know for some people that's not what they needed, and it's driving them crazy. But there's even when you look out and watch people walking down the street, they're not just like, like they're walking, they're looking around. They might be on their phones, yeah, but there is a way of being present that's happening more that is astonishing. Mm-hmm. And I guess that's a connection for me with the lagoon in these last years. It really taught me about that. Yeah.
Yeah. So Cynthia's final question was, the last section in Lost Lagoon, Lost in Thought, notes how, quote, quickly elation could morph into elegy.
Yeah.
This book is not a political tract for sure, but what exactly would you want readers to take with them to keep in mind and heart and in their actions after reading Lost Lagoon, Lost in Thought?
Yeah. I think I've got a little note here to myself about this. I think it's what I would like to say is that the natural world is here, and it's here right now, and it's the mentor that I would say most of us have been longing for. But the only way we can have that kind of nourishment from it is to be quiet and to take time away from time as we know it. And I think a big insight for me is watching the animals and how the difference between animals and humans. So this is the baseline. An animal is always cautious. And I find that we as humans, in this way we're living, our baseline is doubt. And for an animal who's always cautious, that means they have to be constantly alert. And for us, I find that the level of growing anxiety in society is phenomenal. So I think that we become more and more anxious, where animals become more and more alert. And then ultimately, they're just being more attentive, and we're searching. We're constantly searching. So I think that's what for me, that's what the Lagoon life has taught me, and I'm really grateful. Yeah, and I just wish you all good health and gaining whatever you can from this really difficult time, and also doing the writing and making the art and having the conversations that we need to have for our planet. It's the only
I think
one.
that's it's a lovely note to end on. And I want to thank everyone for joining us, for Betsy and her willingness to give this a shot. I know book event online, it's kind of an odd concept, but it was great to see so many people, so many familiar faces. And want to encourage you, of course, to buy the book. Feel free to email us at Caitlin Press if you have any questions. And I'm sure, Betsy, they can reach out to you through your website or all the social media channels. And thank you so much.
Thank you so much.
Quietly clap.
Yes. And thank you. Yeah.
Great.
Thank you, Monica.
Take care.
Toodaloo.